In 1984, the horror began. Los Angeles was under siege, gripped by a predator who struck in the dead of night.
Your doors, lock your windows. If you have the ability to provide additional security devices, then by all means do so.
Who wants to be next? I don't. No one else does.
Death waited in the darkness, at the hands of a man they would come to call the Night Stalker.
Everybody was scared. Everybody in the county of Los Angeles and Southern California was scared to death.
After a 14-month reign of terror, he was finally caught. It was only then that his true identity was revealed: Richard Ramirez. Ramirez's method was chillingly simple. He would hide in trees or crouch behind fences, watching his victims under the cover of night. Then, while they slept, he would sneak in like a coward, taking their lives in their sleep.
Ramirez's whole trip was to hide in a tree or hide behind a fence and watch his victims at nighttime and wait into the wee hours of the night. And then, while they slept, creep in, like a coward, and kill them.
The Night Stalker killed dozens of people, at least 13 confirmed murders victims who were violently awakened in the dead of night to face death. At least 15 others survived his brutal attacks.
I entered through an unlocked door through the back entrance and entered into the bedroom. I awoke to see a man standing there. I shouted at him, "Who are you? What do you want?" We argued back and forth for a moment or two. Then he leaned over and shot me directly in the face. As I fell backwards, he leaned over then and shot my husband. We laid back down on the bed and stunned because we couldn't believe that we had been shot. It was the furthest thing from our minds. There was no pain at the time. Then we became aware that he was standing over us laughing.
What made Richard Ramirez even more chilling than his crimes was his unrepentant attitude. Captured, tried, and convicted, he showed no remorse, even taking pride in the fear he had caused.
Regretting is not my style. I cannot regret. It just isn't me.
Was it his troubled childhood, marked by abuse and hardship, that shaped him into the man he became?
Like a recipe. Poverty, drugs, child abuse.
Or was it the heartbreak of losing his first love as a teenager?
I have been in love.
When? How old were you?
I was 15. I was 15.
And what happened?
I got sent, I was with her 3 years and I got sent to reform school. And when I came back, we lost touch and she got married and that was it.
And how much did his fascination with Satanism drive his descent into darkness?
Yes, I am evil. Not 100%, but I am evil. Evil has always existed. The perfect world most people seek shall never come to pass, and it's going to get worse. The great epochs of our life is when we gain the courage to rebaptize our evil qualities as being our best qualities.
These questions only add to the mystery of a man who thrived on chaos and destruction. Yet, despite all the darkness, Ramirez's life took a strange and unexpected turn. Even while he sat on death row, some people were drawn to him. One of them was Doreen Lioy, a well-educated freelance editor who believed he wasn't a monster but a misunderstood man.
He's very sexy in my eyes. I just think he's a gorgeous person. And to me, he's as beautiful inside as he is outside.
Their relationship led to one of the most shocking moments of his life, a wedding held inside prison walls.
California's Night Stalker has married behind bars.
And so we step into one of the most bizarre chapters of Richard Ramirez's story. The bride wore a calf-length white wedding dress with elegant lace sleeves, while the groom stood beside her in starched prison blues. His pants were slightly too long, and his shirt tails hung loosely. She was glowing with happiness, but he looked nervous. On October 3rd, 1996, this unusual ceremony took place inside the stark, gray-walled visiting room of California's San Quentin prison. The bride, Doreen Lioy, was a 41-year-old freelance magazine editor with a bachelor's degree in English and an IQ of 152. The groom, none other than Richard Ramirez, the infamous Night Stalker, a convicted serial killer and rapist awaiting execution on death row. 7 years before this prison wedding, in 1989, Richard Ramirez was convicted of 43 charges, including 13 brutal murders. Authorities suspected he was responsible for several more. Beginning in the spring of 1985, residents of Los Angeles County were gripped by fear as the Night Stalker prowled the streets. His nocturnal attacks forced families to change their routines, install stronger locks, and invest in security systems. The media dubbed him the Night Stalker because, like a vampire, he always struck under the cover of darkness.
Very, very hot summer. I would not open the windows at night. We sweltered in our house every night because I was afraid somebody would come in and kill me.
The visiting room at San Quentin Prison was crowded that day, with rows of orange plastic seats bolted to the floor and vending machines lining one wall. Families and other visitors went about their business, but many couldn't help but stare at the infamous inmate. The Night Stalker was a shadow of the menacing figure who had terrified courtrooms during his 1989 trial. Gone were his signature dark sunglasses. Now 36 years old, Richard Ramirez wore round prescription glasses, looking far less intimidating than the legend surrounding his name. Richard Ramirez moved hesitantly, seeming uncomfortable in the spotlight. His bride, a long-haired brunette, had first reached out to him after his arrest in 1985.
I just want to say I'm ecstatically happy today and very, very proud to have married Richard and to be his wife.
Over the years, she sent him nearly 75 letters, professing her devotion. Ramirez proposed to her in 1988, but prison regulations delayed their wedding for years. Other women competed for Ramirez's attention, visiting him in prison and showering him with letters and gifts. Doreen often encountered them during her visits, and one even threatened her with physical violence if she didn't step aside. But Doreen was undeterred. Her persistence paid off, and in the end, she became the Night Stalker's bride. Doreen claimed she was a virgin at the time of their wedding, a fact that wouldn't change since conjugal visits were not allowed for death row inmates. According to Philip Carlo, author of The Night Stalker, Ramirez was particularly drawn to her because of this. Raised as a Roman Catholic, Doreen later identified as agnostic, which allowed her to accept Ramirez's devotion to Satanism without hesitation.
After a long, hard day at work, to my one and only love, Richard. And I had his gratitude. And his said, I love you forever.
When Doreen purchased their wedding rings, she chose a gold band for herself but a platinum band for Ramirez. He had told her that Satanists don't wear gold. Their civil ceremony began at 11:10 a.m., officiated by Mr. L. Weister, who also married 2 other inmate couples that same morning. Ramirez's sister Ruth, his brother Joseph, and Joseph's teenage daughter attended. Ramirez cautioned his niece to pull down her skirt. He knew other inmates were ogling her. As the couple exchanged their vows, Doreen's face lit up with joy. Her long-awaited dream was finally becoming a reality. She was now Mrs. Richard Ramirez.
Feels wonderful. I'm so happy. I'm so thrilled, very proud, and a little relieved that the bulk of the day is over, and just hopefully I can enjoy the rest of my day in peace with Richard's family.
Doreen refused to accept the overwhelming evidence presented during Ramirez's trial, choosing to ignore the horrifying testimonies of his crimes. Richard Ramirez, known for striking in the dead of night, would sneak into his victims' bedrooms. The men were usually killed quickly, often with a gunshot to the head. Women, however, were kept alive, tormented after Ramirez ransacked their homes for valuables. He would rape and degrade them, often repeatedly, before killing them or attempting to. Incredibly, some of his victims survived these brutal attacks.
He needed to associate gruesome violence with sex in order to be completely satisfied. He also told me that he had to violently fantasize about his victims before he could go away sexually gratified.
They are desires, whereas if I didn't give in to them, I would be crushed by them.
Among the world's most notorious serial killers, The Night Stalker stood out for the sheer terror his crimes evoked. He was a living nightmare, a modern-day boogeyman who invaded bedrooms and ripped innocent people from their dreams. His methods seemed like something out of a low-budget horror movie, yet they were tragically real. Richard Ramirez seemed perfectly suited to his hunting ground, Los Angeles. In 1978, at the age of 18, Ramirez-born Ricardo Leyva moved from his hometown of El Paso, Texas, to Southern California. According to reports, he had dropped out of 9th grade and spent his days living aimlessly, smoking marijuana, and surviving on convenience store junk food. Ramirez's diet, packed with sugar and junk food, eventually caused his teeth to rot, giving him foul, offensive breath, a feature that seemed to align with the demonic persona he intentionally crafted. His frequent marijuana use led to several arrests for possession, as well as a misdemeanor theft charge. By the early 1980s, Ramirez had been arrested twice for auto theft, once in Pasadena in 1981 and again in Los Angeles in 1984.
I did start seeing something going wrong with Ricky Ramirez. I think what really messed him up was the acid. He would do a lot of acid. The stealing, I noticed the stealing, and then started as a peeping Tom and things like that. He said he was fired, he was dismissed due to the cause that he had tried to molest two little kids that were going up the elevator.
Ramirez's father insisted that his son was a good boy who had simply lost control because of marijuana. But it's difficult to pinpoint what exactly drew Ramirez toward devil worship. He frequently drew 5-point pentagrams, the symbol of Satan, on his body and openly shouted, "Hail Satan," in court after his trial.
It was not enough just to murder or to rape. He had to torture, and he loved to terrorize him. He would make him say, "Hail Satan."
Ramirez was also an avid fan of heavy metal music, particularly the Australian band AC/DC, whose album Highway to Hell was his absolute favorite. One song from AC/DC's Highway to Hell album, titled Night Prowler, seemed almost prophetic to Ramirez. The haunting lyrics described slipping into a room under the cover of darkness. Was that a noise outside your window? What's that shadow on the blind? As you lie there naked like a body in a tomb, suspended animation as I slip into your room. However, it's unlikely that music and marijuana alone could transform a troubled teenager into one of the most notorious serial rapists and murderers in history. Richard Ramirez's method of killing mirrored the very lyrics of Night Prowler. Much like the song, he would slip into his victims' rooms under the cover of darkness, often through a window while they slept. The true turning point in Richard Ramirez's life may have come the night he witnessed his cousin Mike brutally murder his wife. Mike, a Green Beret who had served in Vietnam, returned home a changed man.
Miguel, oh man, that guy, when he came back from Vietnam, he was something else.
He often bragged about torturing and mutilating enemy soldiers, even showing Polaroids as proof.
He bragged about killing women, Vietnamese and Viet Cong women as well, molesting them.
At 13, Richard Ramirez spent countless hours with his cousin, getting high and listening to Mike's gruesome stories. One day, as they were smoking marijuana, Mike's wife began scolding him about finding a job and getting his life together. Without hesitation, Mike pulled out a gun and shot her in the face. Blood splattered across Ramirez, who stood frozen in shock.
So there was a tragic incident where Ramirez was spending time with his cousin.
It was a sunny day. I had been with Mike that day, hanging out, and he got to his house about 3 p.m.
He went and got the gun from the top of the refrigerator and got close to her and blew her head off, right here. Where she saw everything.
In court, Mike's lawyer argued that his violent actions were a result of the extreme psychological toll of war. Though he was convicted, the judge showed leniency in his sentencing. Mike had a profound influence on Richard, who became obsessed with the gruesome photographs of war victims that his cousin had shown him. After witnessing Mike murder his wife, the youngest of 5 siblings already battling epilepsy began to spiral further. Richard skipped school frequently, smoked marijuana daily, and resorted to stealing to fund his growing drug habit. There is no evidence that Ramirez killed anyone before moving to Los Angeles, but little is known about his activities during those early years. However, it's clear his behavior was escalating, laying the groundwork for the violence to come. What began as simple theft quickly escalated to breaking and entering. Ramirez likely started by stealing whatever valuables he could find before fleeing, but as his skills improved, so did his boldness. He began lingering in the homes he burglarized, perhaps watching the residents as they slept or taking personal items, especially those belonging to women. Like his cousin Mike, he might have even taken photographs to relive the experience later. These actions fueled his growing depravity, allowing him to create fantasies that consumed his mind. But eventually, the dark scenes playing on a loop in his imagination weren't enough. He needed to turn them into reality. When Richard Ramirez finally acted on his dark fantasies, the Night Stalker emerged. Whether it was a deliberate decision or a natural escalation of his depravity, he began turning his twisted thoughts into horrifying reality. His first known victim was 79-year-old Jenny Vinkow, a resident of Glassell Park. On the night of June 28, 1984, Jenny left a window open to escape the summer heat. Ramirez took advantage, removing the screen and slipping inside. The following morning, Jenny Vinkow's son, who lived in the apartment above hers, made a horrifying discovery. His mother's body lay sprawled on the bed, brutally stabbed, her throat slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. Ramirez had ransacked her apartment, stealing valuables, and left behind fingerprints on the windowsill. The autopsy revealed chilling signs of sexual assault. For Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, his dark fantasy had become a gruesome reality.
Jenny Vinkow, even at 79 years old, tried to fend off her attacker. She was doing everything she could to save her own life.
Ramirez winds up butchering Jenny Vinkow. She was really ultimately mutilated by him.
It would be another 8 months before he struck again. After his first murder, Richard Ramirez likely became consumed by the memory, replaying the details repeatedly in his mind. Like many serial killers, he may have taken a keepsake such as a hairbrush or piece of clothing to fuel his fantasies and relive the power he felt that night.
Many serial murderers take souvenirs from people that they kill, whether it's a piece of flesh, piece of jewelry, something. It is a concrete reminder. It's something they can see, something they can hold on to, something that says, wow, you did this.
These souvenirs would help him elaborate on the experience. But over time, even the vivid recollections weren't enough. The initial thrill began to fade, and the pressure to kill again grew stronger. Unable to resist the compulsion, Ramirez gave in to his dark urges, seeking a new victim to reignite his twisted fantasies. On the night of March 17, 1985, 20-year-old Angela Barrios returned home after a long day at work. Exhausted and hungry, she pulled her car into the driveway of the condominium she shared with a roommate in Rosemead, a quiet, middle-class town northeast of Los Angeles. Using her remote control, she opened the garage door, eager to get inside and unwind. But as she stepped out of her car, an unexpected sound came from behind her, a sound that would change her life forever. Out of the shadows, a dark figure rushed toward Angela. He was tall, dressed entirely in black, with a navy blue baseball cap pulled low over his brow. In his hand, he held a gun, which he pointed directly at her face, just inches from her nose. Angela froze in terror and began pleading for her life, begging him not to kill her. She tried to avoid looking at his face, hoping he might show mercy if she didn't identify him. But when her eyes met his, all she saw were cold, hard eyes, devoid of any emotion. Her pleas fell on deaf ears. Seemingly irritated by her pleading, the man pulled the trigger. The sound of the gunshot echoed like an explosion in the enclosed garage. Angela fell to the concrete floor, her heart pounding, but she was still alive. Paralyzed with fear, she lay motionless, pretending to be dead. The gunman stepped over her body without hesitation, shoving her aside with his foot as he moved toward the door leading to her condo. After what felt like an eternity, Angela noticed her hand was bleeding. Her keys were still clenched tightly in her fist. she realized that when she had instinctively raised her hands to protect herself, the bullet had struck her keys, deflecting it and saving her life. Gathering her courage, she managed to get to her feet and started running out of the garage. But before she could get far, another gunshot rang out behind her. Angela kept running, her only thought to escape. But as she turned a corner, she came face to face with the man in black as he exited the front door of her condo. Panicking, she tried to run, but her shaky legs gave way, and she stumbled back toward her car in the garage. Certain this would be the end, she braced herself for the worst. But to her surprise, the man didn't follow. Instead, he shoved the gun into his belt and disappeared into the night. Angela Barrios narrowly escaped with her life, but her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Okazaki, wasn't as fortunate. When Angela entered the kitchen, she was met with a horrific sight: Dale lying face down in a pool of blood. The walls, furniture, and appliances were splattered with crimson. Desperate, Angela rushed to her roommate's side, searching for any sign of life. But Dale had been shot through the forehead, the wound fatal. Shaking, Angela grabbed the phone and dialed 911. When police arrived at the scene, they found a crucial piece of evidence: a baseball cap left behind in the garage by the killer. What transpired inside the condominium remains unclear, but for some reason, Dale Okazaki's murder didn't satisfy Richard Ramirez's twisted desires.
Dale Okazaki was lying on her back in the kitchen. She had sustained a gunshot wound to the head.
Unbelievably, that very same night, he struck again in the nearby town of Monterey Park.
It occurred about a half hour later. It was in the same general area of town, and the same gun was used.
Author Clifford L. Leyendecker recounts that a police officer was dispatched to investigate an empty yellow Chevrolet left parked with its engine running. The car's transmission was in reverse, but a vehicle parked behind it prevented it from moving any farther. As the officer approached the scene, he noticed an unconscious woman lying on the ground nearby. The officer rushed to the woman and checked her vital signs. Her stockings were torn, and a large bruise covered her leg. She was alive, but only barely. Acting quickly, he ran to his patrol car and called for an ambulance. Returning to her side, he noticed a metal medallion and a ripped piece of a $20 bill scattered on the pavement nearby. He attempted to revive her, hoping she could explain what had happened, but her breathing was shallow and labored. In the dim light, he didn't immediately realize she had been shot multiple times and was in critical condition. The woman, identified as 30-year-old Tia Lien Yu, a Taiwanese native known to her friends as Victoria, succumbed to her injuries before the ambulance could arrive. Richard Ramirez was in a frenzy. Dale Okazaki's murder had failed to satisfy his insatiable hunger for violence. Acting on impulse, he brutally attacked and killed Victoria.
Almost immediately, we were aware that we had some sort of a series going, not knowing just how big it was going to get or grow.
Yet even this horrifying act didn't seem to fulfill his twisted desires, as 3 days later he struck again, this time targeting an 8-year-old girl in Eagle Rock, California. The young girl, Maureen Mo Fiala, was attacked on March 27, 1985, just a few days after the murders of Dale Okazaki and Victoria. Tragically, Maureen succumbed to her injuries before the ambulance could arrive. She became one of the youngest victims of Ramirez's brutal killing spree. Just a week later, on March 27, 1985, Ramirez struck again. This time, he would develop a pattern, a method that brought him the twisted gratification he sought. That morning, Peter Zazera arrived at his parents' home in Whittier, California. His father, Vincent, 64, had retired from investment counseling and now ran a small pizzeria, while his mother, Maxine, 44, worked as an attorney. After ringing the doorbell several times without a response, Peter let himself inside only to face a scene of unimaginable horror. What Peter found inside was beyond anything he could have imagined. His father's lifeless body lay on the sofa in the den, a gunshot wound to his left temple. It appeared Vincent had died instantly. Upstairs, in the bedroom, Peter discovered his mother, Maxine, face up on the bed, naked and horrifically mutilated. Her eyes had been gouged out, leaving empty, bloodied sockets. She had been stabbed multiple times in the face, neck, abdomen, and groin, with a large T-shaped wound carved into her left breast. An autopsy would later confirm that, like her husband, Maxine had been shot first and likely died instantly. The gruesome stabbing and mutilation had been carried out post-mortem.
The woman's eyes were gouged out, not to be found.
From people that they kill, whether it's a piece of flesh, piece of jewelry, something. It is a concrete reminder. It's something they can see, something they can hold on to, something that says, wow, you did this.
The house had been thoroughly ransacked, with valuables stolen. These murders marked a turning point for Richard Ramirez. He had found a method that fulfilled his twisted desires and would repeat it many times. His approach was calculated to eliminate the male victim quickly to remove any obstacle, allowing him to focus on the woman in the home. For Ramirez, the man was merely a barrier, while the woman was the true target of his perverse fantasies. 6 weeks later, Richard Ramirez returned to Monterey Park, targeting the home of Harold and Jean Wu. The couple had been sound asleep when Ramirez broke in. He dealt with Harold first, shooting the 66-year-old man in the head without hesitation. Turning his attention to Jean, who was 63, Ramirez beat her viciously with his fists, demanding to know where she kept her money. Distraught over her husband's fate, Jean couldn't provide coherent answers. Frustrated, Ramirez bound her hands behind her back with thumb cuffs to immobilize her while he searched the house. After taking what he wanted, he returned to the bedroom, dragged Jean to the side of the bed, and raped her before fleeing into the night. Despite the gunshot wound to his head, Harold Wu was not immediately dead. Summoning every ounce of strength, he crawled to the den and managed to dial 911. Though he couldn't speak to the dispatcher, the call was traced, and emergency services were dispatched to the home. Harold was rushed to the hospital, but tragically succumbed to his injuries later that night. Jean Wu survived the brutal assault and was treated for her injuries. She provided the police with a physical description of her attacker, offering a crucial lead in the hunt for the Night Stalker. 2 weeks later, on May 30th, Richard Ramirez struck again. Ruth Wilson, a 41-year-old mother, was jolted awake in the middle of the night by the beam of a flashlight shining in her face. Ramirez had broken into her Burbank home silently and was now holding a gun to her head. He ordered her to get out of bed and follow him to her 12-year-old son's room. Once there, Ramirez climbed onto the boy's bed and pressed the gun to his head, warning Ruth not to make a sound. After handcuffing the terrified boy, Ramirez locked him in a closet. Turning back to Ruth, he growled, "Don't look at me. If you look at me again, I'll shoot you." Believing he was only there to rob her, Ruth offered to give Ramirez her most valuable possession, a gold and diamond necklace. Hoping this would appease him, she led him to her bedroom dresser where the necklace was kept. But Ramirez wasn't satisfied. After rummaging through the house, he ordered her to turn around and put her hands together. Using a pair of pantyhose, he tied her wrists tightly behind her back before shoving her onto the bed, ignoring her desperate pleas for mercy. Ramirez tore off Ruth's pink nightgown and assaulted her. His breath was so hot and foul that she nearly gagged under his weight. In a desperate attempt to humanize herself, Ruth told him he must have had a very unhappy life to do something so cruel. Ramirez responded coldly, telling her she looked good for her age and that he would let her live, even though he had killed many others. When she complained that the pantyhose binding her wrists were cutting off her circulation, he loosened them slightly and even brought her a robe. Afterward, he retrieved her son from the closet, handcuffing them side by side before fleeing into the night. Later, Ruth's son managed to free himself and call 911. When officers arrived, Ruth described her attacker as a tall Hispanic man with long, dark hair. As news of the attack spread, the city of Los Angeles descended into panic. A police official referred to the elusive assailant as the Valley Intruder, while newspapers labeled him the Midnight Stalker, evoking images of a modern-day Dracula or Jack the Ripper. But for Richard Ramirez, this was only the beginning.
When I was first contacted about the murders, police were baffled. They had no idea who was doing this, how it was happening. They wondered what type of a person would have done this. I mean, was it a maniac? Was it a group of people? Because don't forget, in California, they had Charles Manson, who, with his cult, went out to murdering an awful lot of individuals.
By the spring of 1985, Richard Ramirez's violence was escalating rapidly. As summer approached, his killing spree reached a fever pitch. On May 29th, 83-year-old Malvia Keller and her 80-year-old disabled sister, Blanche Wolfe, were discovered brutally attacked in Keller's Monrovia home. The brutality of the attack on Malvia Keller and her sister Blanche Wolfe was staggering. Both women had been bludgeoned with a hammer so violently that the handle was split in two. Blanche suffered a puncture wound above one ear, while an inverted pentagram, drawn in lipstick, was found on Malvia's inner thigh. Another pentagram was scrawled on the bedroom wall above Blanche's comatose body. Ramirez had attempted to rape Malvia, the older sister. Investigators estimated the sisters had been left for 2 days before being discovered. Doctors managed to revive Blanche, but tragically, Malvia succumbed to her injuries.
There was a whole aspect of the occult.
There were some pentagrams, some things written on the wall. There were some markings on the body.
1 month later, on June 27th, the Night Stalker raped a 6-year-old girl in Arcadia. A day later, the body of 32-year-old Patty Elaine Higgins was found in her Arcadia home. Her throat slit. 5 days later, on July 2nd, the body of 75-year-old Mary Louise Cannon was found in her Arcadia home. Like Patty Higgins, she had been beaten. Her throat slit. The house had been ransacked. On July 5th, Ramirez returned to Arcadia, where he attacked 16-year-old Deirdre Palmer with a tire iron, savagely beating her. Miraculously, Deirdre survived the assault.
Talk about a nightmare. Her parents awakened to her crying and coming down the hall. They find her in her bedroom on the floor, covered in blood. The suspect had entered the house, confronted her in bed while she was asleep, and beat her with a tire iron.
Just 2 days later, on July 7th, the body of 61-year-old Joyce Lucille Nelson was discovered in her Monterey Park home. She had been brutally beaten to death with a blunt object, marking yet another horrifying act of violence in Ramirez's relentless spree. Later that same night in Monterey Park, 63-year-old registered nurse Linda Fortuna was startled awake around 3:30 a.m. by a tall, thin man dressed in black. The man, fitting the description of the Night Stalker, pointed a gun at her and ordered her out of bed, forcing her into the bathroom with a stern warning to stay silent. After ransacking her home, he returned and forced her onto her bed. Ramirez attempted to rape and sodomize her but couldn't maintain an erection, leaving him visibly frustrated and enraged. Linda was certain he would kill her. Instead, after screaming furiously, he gathered the valuables he had stolen and left. Linda was shocked to have survived the ordeal.
About 3 o'clock in the morning, my friend said, "Someone's calling your name, somebody's yelling for you." I went to the back fence and called across the street to the lady calling me and asked her what was wrong. And she told me that she had been robbed and raped and she was handcuffed to her bed.
By July 7th, 1985, Richard Ramirez had killed at least 12 times, and his violent home invasions were about to escalate, plunging the people of Los Angeles into panic. In 1985, Los Angeles County was in the grip of a vicious serial killer. Ordinary citizens were no longer safe in their homes as the mysterious killer, christened the Night Stalker, raped, murdered, and mutilated in the name of Satan.
Everybody was scared. Everybody in the county of Los Angeles and Southern California was scared to death.
Vast increase in gun sales. During the summer of '85, people were keeping their windows closed.
It was a very, very hot summer. I would not open the windows at night. We sweltered in our house every night because I was afraid somebody'd come in and kill me.
Just under 2 weeks later, on July 20th, Ramirez struck again, this time in Glendale. Maxon Kneeling, 66, and his wife Lila, also 66, were found in their bed, brutally murdered. Both had been shot in the head, and their bodies were horrifically slashed with a knife.
What the FBI was telling us is that serial killers tend to operate in the same way. They'll use the same weapon over and over, the same method of operation. but there were different weapons used. There were 2 separate guns that were used throughout these events. There were knives used on a couple of the occasions. There were bludgeons used on a couple of the occasions. These are all differences in the method of operation.
Maxon's injuries were so severe that his head was nearly decapitated. Investigators struggled to piece together exactly what had happened. It's possible Ramirez killed them quickly with gunshots before mutilating their bodies post-mortem. However, given his escalating patterns, some speculated that he may have kept Lila alive to fulfill his twisted fantasies but failed sexually, just as he had during the attack on Linda Fortuna. So he turned July 20th into a doubleheader, striking again, this time in Sun Valley. Chetata Sawahem, 32, was shot in his sleep. His wife Sakima, 29, was raped, forced to perform oral sex on the intruder, then beaten mercilessly. He then sodomized the couple's 8-year-old son. Ramirez tied Mrs. Asawahem in her bedroom and left, but not before taking $30,000 in cash and jewelry.
We had a couple that lived in a home. The male had been executed in his sleep. The woman had been sexually assaulted. And there was a young boy there that also had been assaulted.
On August 6th, Ramirez targeted another couple, Christopher and Virginia Peterson, aged 38 and 27, in their Northridge home. Following his established pattern, he broke into their bedroom and shot both of them in the head. Miraculously, neither of them died. Christopher, a strong and determined truck driver, managed to get out of bed and chase Ramirez out of the house despite having a bullet lodged in his brain. Miraculously, both Christopher and Virginia Peterson survived their injuries.
Through an unlocked door through the back entrance and entered into the bedroom. I awoke to see a man standing there. I shouted at him, "Who are you? What do you want?" We argued back and forth for a moment or two. Then he leaned over and shot me directly in the face. As I fell backwards, he leaned over then and shot my husband. We lay back down on the bed and stunned because we couldn't believe that we had been shot. It was the furthest thing from our minds. There was no pain at the time. Then we became aware that he was standing over us laughing.
But Ramirez's reign of terror continued just 2 nights later, this time in Diamond Bar, California. Here, he carried out his twisted fantasies without interruption. Ahmed Zia, 35, was shot in the head and killed instantly while he slept. With the husband out of the way, Ramirez turned his attention to Zia's wife, Sukiya Zia, 28. He raped her, sodomized her, and forced her to perform oral sex. This attack exemplified Ramirez's preferred method of operation. Criminal profilers believed he would continue to strike in this way, each time escalating his violence, introducing new perversions, and inflicting even greater physical brutality. Los Angeles County was gripped with fear.
I'm home alone. It's the first time that I've ever slept with my gun on the nightstand.
Everybody was afraid and pretty much kept their doors locked, windows locked, but the night was so hot and our summer was so hot, so here
The
I
Night
had
Stalker's
the doors
crimes
open.
were becoming increasingly frequent, with shorter breaks between each attack. His rage and brutality were escalating with every new victim. There was no question that he would strike again. It was only a matter of where and when. But this time, Ramirez shocked investigators by leaving his usual hunting grounds behind. After the attack on the Zias, Ramirez moved north. On August 18, 1985, Peter and Barbara Pan were discovered in their blood-soaked bed in Lake Merced, a quiet suburb of San Francisco. Both had been shot in the head. Peter, a 66-year-old accountant, was pronounced dead at the scene, while Barbara, 64, survived but was left permanently disabled. On the bedroom wall, written in lipstick, Ramirez had scrawled an inverted pentagram along with the words "Jack the Knife," a reference to The Ripper, a heavy metal song by Judas Priest. Local police determined that the killer had entered the home through an open window. Fearing that L.A.'s infamous Night Stalker had extended his spree to their jurisdiction, homicide investigators sent a bullet recovered from Peter Pan to a forensic team in Los Angeles. The analysis confirmed their fears. The bullet matched those from 2 previous Night Stalker crime scenes in Los Angeles County. Police in San Francisco reviewed their unsolved homicide cases and found 2 incidents that matched the Night Stalker's MO. On February 20th, 1985, sisters Mary and Christina Caldwell, aged 70 and 50, were found stabbed to death in their Telegraph Hill apartment. If Ramirez was indeed responsible, this crime occurred a month before he killed Dale Okazaki, Tianlin Yu, and wounded Angela Barrios. The police also uncovered another chilling connection on June 2nd, the day after the brutal murders of Blanche Wolfe and Malvia Keller. 25-year-old Theodore Wildings was shot in the head while asleep in his apartment in Cow Hollow. His girlfriend, Nancy Bryan, 25, was then brutally raped by the killer. Could the Night Stalker have been operating in both San Francisco and Los Angeles throughout 1985 without the police in San Francisco realizing it? Panic spread quickly throughout the city. To calm public fears, Mayor Dianne Feinstein spoke out about the ongoing hunt for the Night Stalker, but in doing so, she inadvertently angered detectives by revealing too many details about the crimes, which hampered the investigation. San Francisco's police were determined not to repeat the mistakes made in Los Angeles. 15 brutal attacks minus 14 murders and 5 rapes had been committed by a killer who remained maddeningly elusive. However, the police got a break when the manager of a rundown boarding house in the Tenderloin district came forward. He reported that a young man, matching the Night Stalker's description, had stayed at his establishment on several occasions over the past year and a half. The manager recalled that the man had rotten teeth and an overpowering, unpleasant odor. When police checked the room where he had last stayed, they found a pentagram drawn on the bathroom door. The man had checked out on August 17th, the same day Peter and Barbara Pan were attacked. Investigators soon traced the purchase of jewelry, including a diamond ring and a pair of cufflinks, to a man from El Sobrante. He confirmed buying the items from a young man who matched the Night Stalker's description. Further investigation confirmed that the items belonged to Mr. Pan. On August 24th, while San Francisco police were still searching for the mysterious man with the rotten teeth, Ramirez struck again. This time, he targeted a couple in Mission Viejo, 50 miles south of Los Angeles, far from the Bay Area. They were asleep in bed when he broke in to continue his violent spree. A computer engineer and his 29-year-old fiancée had just fallen asleep when loud gunshots abruptly woke them. Instinctively, she reached out for her fiancé, only to find that he had already been seriously wounded. Before she could react, the intruder grabbed her by the hair, pulling her into another bedroom, where he bound her ankles and wrists with neckties. The man then asked her if she knew who he was, boasting that he was the killer gaining attention in the media and on television. The intruder searched through the house for valuables but found little of worth. Frustrated by the couple's lack of possessions, he turned back to the fiancée and raped her, not once but twice. The foul stench of his breath made her gag. Still angry about the lack of items to steal, he threatened her. Terrified, she directed him to a drawer where she knew her fiancé kept some money. "Swear to Satan," he demanded. In her fear, she complied, swearing that she was telling the truth. Ramirez found the money and, as he counted it, mocked her, telling her that this was all she was worth. He claimed it was what had saved her. She prayed that this would be the end, that he would leave now that he had what he wanted. But he wasn't finished yet. "Swear your love for Satan," he demanded. Terrified of what might come next, she complied, whispering, "I love Satan." He ordered her to repeat it again and again.
It was not enough just to murder or to rape. He had to torture, and he loved to terrorize him. He would make him say, "Hail Satan."
He yanked her by the hair, forcing her to kneel before him, and then made her perform oral sex. When he was finished, he stepped back and stared at her. Still bound by the neckties, she feared he would shoot her, just as he had shot her fiancé. But instead, he laughed at her. Without warning, he left, disappearing into the night. She managed to free herself from the neckties and rushed to the window, just in time to see him driving away in an old orange Toyota station wagon. Without hesitation, she called 911. Earlier that evening, a teenager who had been working on his motorcycle in his parents' garage noticed the same orange Toyota driving into the neighborhood. He saw it again as it left, finding it suspicious enough to write down the license plate number. The next morning, he contacted the police with the information. Using the license plate number, the police traced the 1976 orange Toyota to a theft in LA's Chinatown while the owner was dining at a restaurant. An alert was issued, and 2 days later, the car was found in the Rampart district of Los Angeles. The police placed the vehicle under surveillance for nearly 24 hours, hoping the Night Stalker would return, but he never did. A forensics team thoroughly examined the car for evidence and recovered a fingerprint, which was sent to Sacramento for analysis. Hours later, the computer system made a match. The print belonged to Ricardo Richard Livia Ramirez. Further analysis confirmed that the fingerprint also matched one taken from a windowsill at the Pan's home near San Francisco. Finally, the police had identified their suspect. The only remaining challenge was to find him before he could strike again. 7 days after the attack on the computer engineer and his fiancée in Mission Viejo, Ramirez set out in search of another vehicle to steal. Unfortunately for him, he chose the wrong neighborhood. The 3700 block of East Hubbard Street in Los Angeles, a predominantly Hispanic area, was not one where he could easily blend in. Ramirez's first mistake came when he tried to steal Faustino Piñon's prized red Mustang. Wearing a black Jack Daniels t-shirt, he hopped fences between yards, looking for an easy target. Having been chased off the property next door, Ramirez ended up in Faustino Piñon's yard. Thinking his luck had changed, he saw that Piñon's red Mustang was unlocked with the keys in the ignition. He jumped in and started the engine, unaware that Piñon, 56, was underneath the car, working on the transmission. When Piñon heard the engine roar to life, he quickly rolled out from under the car, enraged that someone would dare steal his prized vehicle. Reaching through the window, he grabbed Ramirez by the neck. "I've got a gun," Ramirez warned, but Piñon didn't care. He wasn't going to let anyone take his car. As Ramirez put the car into gear and tried to drive away, Piñon refused to let go. The vehicle crashed into a fence and then into the garage. Piñon managed to get the door open, drag Ramirez out of the car, and throw him to the ground. Ramirez scrambled to his feet and dashed across the street, just as 28-year-old Angelina de la Torres was getting into her Ford Granada. He rushed up to her car, thrusting his head through the driver's window and demanding the keys, threatening to kill her if she didn't comply. Angelina screamed for help, and her husband, 32-year-old Manuel, came running from the backyard. As reported by Nancy Skelton in the Los Angeles Times, Manuel grabbed a metal fence post as he passed through the gate. Meanwhile, Jose Burgoyne, who had heard the commotion at Piñon's house, had already called the police. Jose ran outside to assist Piñon, and when he heard Angelina scream, he shouted for his sons, 21-year-old Jamie and 17-year-old Julio, to hurry. As the brothers rushed to help, they spotted the thin stranger scrambling across the front seat of her car. Jamie immediately recognized him from media reports he was the killer, the Night Stalker. Jamie shouted, alerting everyone that the fugitive was in their midst. The men lunged at him, and Ramirez bolted, running for his life. But de la Torres stayed on his trail, hitting him repeatedly from behind. Jamie caught up with Ramirez and punched him, causing him to stumble. Ramirez quickly regained his footing and continued to flee, with de la Torres and the Burgoyne brothers close behind. Then, to everyone's surprise, Ramirez stopped in his tracks and turned to face his pursuers. His eyes flashed with defiance as he laughed and stuck out his tongue, playing the part of a madman. For a brief moment, his pursuers hesitated, but it didn't last long. They lunged at him again, and the chase resumed. Just a block away from where it all began, de la Torres swung a metal fence post, striking Ramirez on the head. The Night Stalker collapsed to the ground. Jamie and Jose Burgoyne quickly closed in, holding him down until the police arrived. Just 1 day after Richard Ramirez's face was made public, the Night Stalker was finally captured and taken into custody. At 26, he was charged with 14 murders, along with 31 other felonies tied to his 1985 murder, rape, and robbery spree. A 15th murder in San Francisco also loomed over him, along with the possibility of a trial in Orange County for rape and attempted murder.
I can't begin to tell you how proud we, all of us, are of the people in this community who, to a man and a woman, were involved in trying to track this guy down and capture him.
That night, there was dancing in the streets of the East LA neighborhood where Ramirez was caught, a stark contrast to the horror he had unleashed. As his case unfolded, the public's attention turned to the courtroom drama. At the start of his trial, 2 public defenders were appointed to represent Richard Ramirez, but he quickly grew dissatisfied with them. Another defense attorney briefly took on his case, but eventually the Ramirez family retained Daniel and Arturo Hernandez. Though the Hernandez brothers had handled homicide cases, this was their first death penalty case. Their defense efforts were complicated further during the October 1985 arraignment when Ramirez flashed a pentagram drawn on his palm and shouted, "Hail Satan." This behavior caused growing concern in the courtroom. On another occasion, when the lights suddenly went out, deputy marshals drew their pistols and ordered everyone to the ground, then forcibly removed Ramirez from the room. The Hernandez brothers quickly began filing pretrial motions, starting with a request for a change of venue. They argued that the extensive media coverage of the case had tainted the entire Los Angeles community, including the potential jury pool. They claimed Ramirez could not receive a fair trial, as many middle-class residents already had a deeply ingrained image of the Night Stalker invading their homes. A survey conducted by the defense team revealed that 93% of 300 people polled were familiar with Ramirez, and the majority of them believed him to be guilty. On January 10, 1987, the Los Angeles Times reported on the outcome of a 13-day hearing, which was just a glimpse of what was to come. Judge Dion Morrow ruled that, given the large pool of potential jurors in the county, the defense's argument for a change of venue was unfounded. "This is the largest community, I think, of any court system in the country," he said. As Ramirez was led away in chains from the courtroom, he flashed a grin at his growing group of female supporters. Some believed in his innocence, while others simply found him attractive. According to retired lieutenant and former chief of police Gil Correo, during one of Richard Ramirez's trial sessions, as he was walking down the aisle, a woman sitting on the aisle side looked at him, smiled, and with a bold gesture, opened her legs and blew him a kiss. This eerie display of infatuation only added to the unsettling atmosphere surrounding the trial. In a separate hearing, Judge Elva Soper issued a gag order on both sides. By May, a trial date was set for the end of September, but that timeline proved overly optimistic. The case would expand across states and even to Mexico in search of witnesses and evidence. The defense team began introducing numerous delays, ranging from appeals to out-of-town interviews and even missing persons. During pretrial proceedings, Ramirez appeared in a 3-piece gray suit with a red tie. He denied ever telling Sergeant Ed Escalation, after his arrest on August 31st, "I did it, you guys got me." The stalker Ramirez's defense argued that the officer had failed to record the statements and requested that they be dismissed. Superior Court Judge Michael Tynan, who would preside over the trial, rejected the motion. Sergeant George Thomas later testified that Ramirez had said, "Of course I did it, so what, shoot me, I deserve to die," before humming Night Prowler, a song by the band AC/DC. Apart from that brief appearance, Ramirez appeared throughout most of his hearings, slouching in his chair, drumming his fingers on the table, and bobbing his head as though listening to music. He seemed completely detached from the gravity of the charges against him. As the Hernandez brothers requested more time to prepare, the trial date was eventually moved to February. They also considered delaying it further by pursuing a trial for the Orange County charges first. In November, to avoid the additional trial, 1 murder charge and 1 felony count were dropped. The prosecution had little evidence for the murder case, relying on the delayed statement of a witness who had seen Ramirez just a block away from the crime scene. Judge Tynan ruled that Ramirez could not leave the county, preventing his prosecution in Orange County. The defense attorneys, seeking another delay, planned to request at least 6 separate trials to prevent weaker cases from being strengthened by association with stronger ones. By January, it appeared that the trial for Case No. A 777-1272 would be delayed another 6 months due to an appellate court ruling requiring the prosecution to provide defense attorneys with records of similar crimes committed in Los Angeles County over the previous 6 months. The Hernandez brothers aimed to connect some of the charges against Ramirez to other unsolved cases and possibly other perpetrators. Prosecutor Phil Halpin criticized this as an unnecessary burden for law enforcement and asked the court to reconsider. Both sides took the matter to the state Supreme Court, but the court declined to hear the case. San Francisco authorities had tentatively linked Ramirez to 4 homicides, a rape, and 10 burglaries, all committed in March. However, without solid physical evidence tying him to most of these crimes, the focus was narrowed to one case: the murder of Peter Pan. This investigation also led to the discovery of evidence from an attempted murder involving Pan's wife and a burglary that ultimately helped identify Ramirez's full name. The defense and prosecution were waiting for the conclusion of the Los Angeles trial to determine the next steps. In July, as the case approached its 3rd anniversary since Ramirez's arrest, the Times reported that Ramirez had chosen not to plead not guilty by reason of insanity. The judge then ordered jury selection to begin, estimating that the process alone could take 6 to 8 months. The Hernandez team had tried to have Judge Tynan disqualified, claiming he was biased against their client, but their motion was denied. Once again, they argued for more time to prepare. Meanwhile, County Prosecutor Phil Halpin, frustrated by the nearly 100 motions from the defense, mostly aimed at suppressing evidence, finalized his case and filed the charges, catching the defense off guard. Halpin claimed to have nearly 1,000 potential witnesses and hundreds of thousands of pages of statements, reports, and photographs. Acknowledging that it was one of the most complex criminal cases he had encountered, he estimated that the trial could stretch over 2 years. By this point, the case had already cost over $1 million, and one key witness had died. The defense requested yet another extension, but the court decided it was time to move forward. On July 21, 1988, jury selection began. Meanwhile, in Orange County, the jury was also being selected for the trial of Randy Kraft, who was accused of killing 16 young men. Judge Tynan ruled that the trial would require 12 jurors and 12 alternates, all of whom needed to be impartial and available to serve for up to 2 years, a significant challenge, even for that county. To accommodate this, carpenters were brought in to enlarge the jury box. Tynan estimated that they would need to interview as many as 2,000 potential jurors. In the end, nearly 1,600 potential jurors were interviewed. Alan Yokelson joined Halpin on the prosecution team. During the voir dire, Halpin and Daniel Hernandez exchanged so many insults that the judge told them to settle their differences in a boxing ring. He criticized both for their unprofessional behavior. The judge also appointed a public defender, Ray Clark, to assist Daniel Hernandez, as Arturo Hernandez appeared to be absent at times. The defense team had yet to reveal their strategy. The defense still had multiple appeals pending, including one to overturn the judge's decision not to remove Judge Tynan from the case. Ramirez, who often wore all black clothing, began wearing sunglasses as part of his cultivated mysterious persona. Despite his shaggy hair, which reinforced his rebellious image, he started becoming more engaged in the proceedings. On August 3rd, the LA Times reported that jail employees had overheard Ramirez plotting to shoot and kill the prosecutor with a gun that someone was supposedly going to slip to him in the courtroom. To prevent this, a metal detector was installed inside the courtroom, and even the lawyers were searched. Ramirez appeared surprised by the measure, and ultimately no gun was found. After several months, a jury of 12, with alternates, was finally seated. However, one juror was dismissed after making racially biased statements regarding the death penalty. In January 1989, a state appeals court ruled that Daniel Hernandez had been deficient in presenting a case for another client in an earlier murder trial. Hernandez reportedly wasn't surprised by the ruling. He had a history of requesting delays due to stress-induced medical issues. Many were left questioning why the Ramirez family had hired such an inexperienced attorney. Hernandez continued to request delays, but by January 30th, the trial officially began with a 2-hour opening statement from Halpin. He outlined the 13 murders and 30 felony charges against Ramirez, and he planned to present over 400 pieces of evidence, including fingerprints, ballistics data, and shoe impressions, one of which had been found on the face of one of the victims. On the same day, The Times reported that, while in jail in 1985, Ramirez had called himself a supercriminal, boasting that he loved to kill and had murdered 20 people. "I loved all that blood," he reportedly told a sheriff's deputy. Halpin sought to introduce these chilling statements as evidence. Hernandez chose not to make an opening statement at this point, keeping his strategy unclear. The trial then proceeded. While some witnesses struggled with memory recall after 4 years, others were firm in their identification of Richard Ramirez. Some victims provided detailed accounts of their traumatic experiences, even as Ramirez flipped through a notebook filled with graphic crime scene photos. When asked to remove his sunglasses, the defendant refused. Halpin used circumstantial evidence to connect Ramirez to the Avia shoes found at crime scenes. In addition to his presence near the locations of the crimes and his changing modus operandi, the prosecution also presented evidence that linked Ramirez to items stolen from the victims' homes. Fingerprints and other signature evidence further implicated him. On April 14th, after presenting testimony from 137 witnesses and 521 exhibits, the prosecution rested its case. It soon became clear that the defense would argue that the 8 eyewitnesses, some of whom were survivors, had all mistakenly identified Ramirez. They claimed someone else was responsible for the crimes. The defense was given 2 weeks to prepare. One of the major hurdles they faced was the numerous pentagrams found at crime scenes, including on a car that contained Ramirez's fingerprint, on a victim's thigh, on Ramirez himself, and even in his cell. These symbols were used to link the crimes, especially since Ramirez had openly proclaimed himself a Satanist. It was also alleged that he had forced one surviving victim to swear allegiance to Satan while he assaulted her and shot her husband. In addition to fingerprint and shoe impression evidence from Avia shoes, which were allegedly worn by Ramirez, though they could not be located, ballistics evidence pointed to the use of 4 different guns. One of these guns was traced to a man who claimed to have received it from Ramirez. The defense case began 3 weeks later, on May 9th, partly due to the testimony of one of the prosecution's witnesses on May 2nd. The witness had confessed to withholding information while under oath about jewelry and other consumer items that were linked to the victims and received from Ramirez. Halpin himself uncovered the deception and stated that it had no significant impact on the case. Hernandez, however, withheld judgment and looked for any opportunity to file an appeal. On May 4th, the Times published an article about Ramirez's state of mind, describing him as gloomy and distraught. The article also noted that Ramirez had expressed a desire not to mount a defense. The defense attorneys informed the judge that this was a possibility, although they had advised Ramirez against it. Judge Tynan granted a recess so they could discuss it further with their client. In the end, it was decided to continue with the trial, and the defense brought in 38 witnesses. The defense team argued that the prosecution's evidence was either inconclusive or flawed. They pointed out that many fingerprints found at the crime scenes remained unidentified, and that hair and blood samples were discovered which did not match either the victims or Ramirez. In an unexpected move, they called Ramirez's father, Julian Ramirez Tapia, to the stand. He testified that Richard had been in El Paso, Texas, for 8 days starting around May 24, 1985. One rape victim had identified Ramirez as being in her home on Memorial Day, and another attack, which resulted in murder, was said to have occurred between May 29th and June 1st. Additionally, the defense presented testimony suggesting that police officers had covertly informed witnesses about Ramirez's position in the lineup after his arrest. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, an expert in eyewitness testimony from the University of Washington, testified that the stress of the assaults could have compromised the witness's ability to recall details accurately. Loftus also noted that errors in eyewitness identification are more likely when the attacker and victim are of different races. However, under cross-examination, she admitted that victims who had more than a brief exposure to Ramirez were likely to provide more accurate identifications. On May 25th, defense witness Sandra Hotchkiss testified that she had been Ramirez's accomplice in several daytime burglaries in 1985, some of which allegedly occurred during his murder spree. Hotchkiss stated that none of the burglaries had been violent and described Ramirez as jumpy and inexperienced. She eventually ended their association but was later arrested and convicted of other burglaries. Throughout the trial, there were several disruptions, including charts falling from easels, Daniel Hernandez sweating heavily, and instances of evidence being mishandled. Newspapers noted that, throughout the proceedings, the defense attorneys never once claimed their client's innocence. Hernandez told the press that their goal was simply to show that the prosecution's case was flawed. However, rebuttal witnesses for the prosecution disproved Ramirez's father's testimony by presenting evidence that Ramirez was, in fact, in Los Angeles undergoing dental work at the time his father claimed he was in El Paso. A comparison of Ramirez's teeth with dental charts left no doubt, even though he had used an alias. Additionally, a newspaper reporter, David Hancock, contradicted the alibi, revealing that he had interviewed Ramirez's father in August 1985, during which time the man claimed he had not seen his son in over 2 years. Daniel Hernandez was permitted to fly to Texas in search of additional witnesses who might have seen Ramirez. Meanwhile, the jury was granted a break until July 10th. Hernandez managed to locate 2 witnesses, but Halpin argued that if Ramirez had traveled by plane, he could have still returned in time to commit both attacks. One survivor had identified a piece of jewelry found in the El Paso room of Ramirez's sister. Additionally, relatives of a woman murdered in May 1985 had photos of appliances from her home that were later found in Ramirez's possession. The closing arguments, which lasted from July 12 to 25, saw both sides highlighting the weaknesses of the other's case while emphasizing their own. Halpin pointed out that Hernandez had raised several issues without providing evidence, suggesting they were mere distractions for the jury. When Halpin finished, Ramirez turned to the courtroom and smirked. The judge took 2 days to instruct the jury, informing them that a handgun was missing from the evidence inventory, although a photograph of it existed. After nearly a year, the jury began deliberations on July 26th, with 8,000 pages of trial transcripts and 655 exhibits to review. Within a week, one juror who had been repeatedly falling asleep was replaced. On August 14th, Phyllis Singletary failed to appear. The judge summoned the jury, informing them they could not proceed without her, and recessed the court for the day. News soon spread through the jury that Ms. Singletary had been found shot to death in her apartment. This information quickly made its way through the remaining jurors and alternates. The jury couldn't help but wonder if Ramirez had orchestrated the murder from his prison cell and if he might target another juror. Ramirez had a following of black-clad supporters who attended court each day to show their loyalty. They were often referred to as the Charles Manson cult of 1969. The following day, Judge Tynan called the jury into court and informed them that Ms. Singletary had been shot by her abusive boyfriend. He reassured them that the incident had no connection to the case. An alternate juror was selected to replace her, but the woman was so shaken that she was unable to walk to her seat. Further news followed. Ms. Singletary's boyfriend used the same weapon he had used to kill her to take his own life in a hotel. He left behind a written confession, explaining that the couple had been arguing over the Ramirez case, and that he had become enraged by her disapproval of Ramirez's defense lawyers. The defense team worked hard to have a mistrial declared, but Halpern opposed the request, insisting that the case should not be derailed. The incident sparked debates in the newspapers, with one psychologist suggesting that the shooting could subconsciously influence the jury against the defendant. However, the jury foreman assured the judge that they would remain impartial and continue with deliberations. When Ramirez heard this in court, he shouted that the situation was all messed up and had to be restrained. Ramirez continued to act out during the remainder of the deliberations, claiming the trial was unfair. He was allowed to waive his right to be present in court, and for any brief hearings, the proceedings were broadcast into his holding cell. On September 20th, nearly 2 months after deliberations began, the jury announced that they had reached a unanimous decision. Ramirez chose not to be present for the reading of the verdict, and neither did his group of female supporters. On all 43 counts, the jury found him guilty and affirmed 19 special circumstances that made him eligible for the death penalty. As he left his cell, Ramirez flashed a devil's sign, making 2 fingers into horns at the photographers and uttered a single word: evil. The defense team asked Ramirez to assist with the penalty phase, knowing that without any mitigating factors, he was likely to be sentenced to death. "Dying doesn't scare me," Ramirez replied. "I'll be in hell, with Satan." He told his lawyers he wouldn't beg for his life. In an unexpected move, they decided not to call any witnesses and chose not to have him plead for his life. Halpin later admitted that this decision took him by surprise. Clark presented to the jury that something was deeply wrong with Ramirez and urged them to show compassion, even offering sympathy for the devil. Halpin countered, urging the jury to deliver the justice Ramirez deserved. After 4 days of deliberations, on October 3, 1989, the jury returned with their unanimous verdict: death for Richard Ramirez. The female jurors were visibly emotional as they delivered the verdict. Ramirez, present for the reading, was led out of the courtroom smiling. "Big deal," he remarked. "Death always went with the territory." Later, as he was escorted back to the county jail in shackles, he quipped to reporters, "I'll see you in Disneyland." On November 9th, Ramirez was officially sentenced to death 19 times. Throughout the proceedings, he chatted with his attorneys. Afterward, he delivered a chilling speech to the court, adding to his dark persona, "You do not understand me. I do not expect you to. You are not capable of it. I am beyond your experience. I am beyond good and evil. Legions of the night breed. Do not repeat the errors of the night prowler and show no mercy. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells within us all." He condemned the court officials as liars, haters, and parasitic worms, insisting he had been misunderstood. As he was led away to join the 262 other inmates on death row at San Quentin, including freeway killer Randy Kraft, who had been sentenced a month earlier, he asked, "Where are the women?" He then flashed his signature two-fingered devil symbol at a busload of female prisoners, who called out "killer," causing him to smile. To truly understand Richard Ramirez and his obsession with the devil, we must consider more than just his life. We need to examine the cultural climate of the time. Ramirez carried out his murder spree in 1985, during a period marked by widespread satanic panic across the country. Fears of Satanists and secret evil conspiracies grew, fueled by stories of ritual abuse and satanic rings shared by individuals in therapy, despite a lack of evidence to support such claims. Large groups of people began experiencing similar physical symptoms, which were largely emotional in origin. The concept of ritual abuse was widely propagated by journalists, therapists, physicians, drug companies, and others who had a stake in the narrative. Even serial killers began to adopt satanic imagery. During the 1980s, Robert Berdella murdered 6 men in Missouri, claiming it was for satanic purposes. Anthony Costa killed 4 women in Cape Cod as part of ritualistic killings. Thomas Creech confessed to 47 satanic sacrifices, and Larry Eiler buried 4 of his victims under a barn marked with an inverted pentagram. Nurse Donald Harvey, suspected in the deaths of 47 patients, admitted to a fascination with black magic. Leonard Lake, who partnered with Charles Ng for a series of torture murders, was involved with a witch's coven. One killer targeted homeless men, using a circle of salt to mark his victims. A teenager, eager to follow the devil, murdered his parents in their beds. During the 1980s, a former associate of John Wayne Gacy, Robin Goetsch, inspired a group of 3 men known as the Ripper Crew. They were responsible for the brutal murders of an estimated 18 women. Their ritual included severing the left breast of their victims with a thin wire, cleaning it for sexual gratification, and then cutting it into pieces to consume. They claimed to be worshiping Satan, with the act of eating the flesh serving as a form of demonic communion. Ramirez shared a similar obsession with Satan. He would sneak into homes at night, dressed in black, and move stealthily through the darkness. Sometimes he would remove the eyes of his victims, as though performing a ritual. He bludgeoned 2 elderly sisters and left satanic symbols in the form of a pentagram on the thigh of one of them. He also drew pentagrams on the walls using lipstick. When arrested, Ramirez reportedly claimed he was a minion of Satan, sent to carry out the Dark One's will. Was this declaration a tactic to set up an insanity defense, or did he genuinely believe it? If he truly believed it, did this belief fuel his brutality? Did it drive him to kill? Let's examine some of the key factors in his life that are often linked to the development of a violent temperament. Richard Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas, in 1960, the youngest of 5 children. Neighbors described him as a quiet boy with hardworking parents. However, Richard's father had a violent temper and often beat the children. Growing up with such an abusive role model can have a profound impact on a child, particularly a boy witnessing his father's aggression. Adding to this was possible abuse from a male teacher, providing Richard with 2 troubling role models who taught him how to dominate and control others. Richard feared his father and often fled the house, sometimes spending the night in a nearby cemetery, seeking solace among the dead. He found solace among the dead, which may have been where his attraction to the macabre first began. One way to overcome fear is to identify with the source of that fear, and in Richard's case, that meant transforming into something frightening himself. Many criminals take this path, turning from victims into victimizers. But Ramirez took this transformation even further. It wasn't just about scaring people, but about mutilating them, degrading them, and spreading their fear. Ramirez also struggled with epileptic seizures, which were seen as a weakness in his South Texas community, particularly since it forced him to give up playing football. This led him to become a loner in school, where he was thin and girlish in appearance, possibly making him a target for ridicule. Despite this, he had aspirations of fame. He wanted to be known, to make a lasting impact. Richard looked up to an older cousin named Mike, who seemed to take on the role of a father figure. Mike had a reputation for proving his toughness, especially through fighting. As Richard spent more time with him, he absorbed Mike's worldview and came to admire his attitude. Mike had survived the horrors of Vietnam, and upon returning, he was even more hardened, covered in tattoos. To Richard, Mike became a larger-than-life figure, someone who had survived an ordeal and possessed secrets from an exotic place. But what captivated Richard even more were the graphic photographs Mike showed him, depicting the butchered bodies of the dead, including women. Mike claimed that killing made him feel like a god, the most powerful being, and he boasted about raping and murdering several women, showing Richard the photos as proof. While Richard may have been shocked initially, he eventually got used to such sights, mostly since it was essential to show Mike that he could handle it. Mike might have been testing young Richard, not yet even an adolescent, but Richard was up to the test. He took it in and wanted more. The key insight here is that Richard's exposure to Mike's atrocities occurred at a time in his life when he was also becoming a young man, and often when things get associated with physical excitement and intrigue during early sexual development, they also become eroticized. Thus, they become part of the mental landscape as well. Sexual fantasies can develop from the associated images, and those fantasies become repetitive and more detailed throughout one's life and may lay the groundwork for later acts. Richard was reportedly shown Polaroids by Mike, depicting sexual acts where the woman was a helpless victim, as well as images of Mike killing these same women. Richard witnessed how his idol could commit such acts without hesitation, and he likely became aroused by the images of naked women in vulnerable positions, learning that women could be easily objectified and degraded. This behavior was framed as part of being a real man, yet it was also forbidden, which only added to its allure in Richard's eyes. Additionally, Mike introduced Richard to the art of hunting, teaching him to stalk and observe animals in the desert at night. Mike would demonstrate how to kill animals using a knife or gun, and it's likely that these hunting excursions involved a certain thrill from the violence. As Richard grew, Mike became his role model, and anything Mike did without fear, Richard wanted to emulate. This admiration led to a pivotal moment that would reinforce all the violent lessons Richard had learned from Mike. One day, Mike got into a confrontation with his wife, who had been pressuring him to find a job. In a fit of rage, he shot her with a revolver, then ordered Richard to leave. Mike was later sent to a mental institution, deemed temporarily insane for the crime. Immediately after the incident, Richard entered the house with his father and was struck by the sight and smell of blood. He later confessed to author Philip Carlo in The Night Stalker that he felt a strange, almost mystical connection to the dead. Some psychologists consider this moment a pivotal turning point for Richard. However, it's more likely that he had already become desensitized to death, particularly with women, due to the disturbing photographs Mike had shown him and his experience with killing animals. This event was probably less traumatic for Richard than it would have been for others, as he had already been exposed to such violence. By this point, emotional numbness had taken hold. Had the incident been as traumatic as it might have been, Richard might have run from the apartment to report it to the police or gone into a deep depression, distancing himself from his cousin. Instead, he told no one that he had witnessed the crime. What was also significant in his development is that Richard attended church, which meant he was able to reconcile his religious beliefs with his cousin's violent actions. This ability to compartmentalize acting and thinking differently in various situations was a crucial part of his transformation. This is the most dangerous trait in a person, as it makes it difficult for others to recognize the violent tendencies within them, allowing those tendencies to go unchecked. Richard may not even have seen his actions as wrong. Eventually, Richard came across the Church of Satan, and it seemed to pull all the threads of his personality together. The themes of dominance, control, and power resonated with him, as did the concept of something sacred even if it was evil. This ideology may have helped him suppress any feelings of weakness. At 18, he moved to California, where his life lacked direction. He resorted to stealing cars, listening to music, and seeking out opportunities, whatever they might be. He stole without hesitation, bought drugs, and continued to search for something that would give him a sense of significance. Richard Ramirez, observing the culture around him, realized that fear of Satan was pervasive just as it had been during the 1983 McMartin preschool scandal, when teachers were accused of being part of a satanic cult corrupting children. To him, aligning with the Prince of Darkness would grant him a unique sense of power. People would fear him, which in his mind meant control. So he embraced the symbols of Satanism that were popular in the 1970s and 80s: pentagrams, black clothing, demonic imagery, and a love for the night. Inspired by the song Night Prowler, he recognized that the person who instilled fear was the one in control. His murder spree gained him notoriety, and though he was caught and put on trial, it was clear that being just another serial killer wasn't enough for him. By the 1980s, there were plenty of killers like him, with even another high-profile trial happening in Orange County at the same time. Ramirez believed he had set himself apart with his embrace of Satanism and made sure to emphasize this persona for the media. At his preliminary hearing, he flashed a pentagram tattooed on the palm of his hand. After his conviction, his lawyers warned him that he could face the death penalty. "I'll be in hell," then he replied. With Satan, he saw the media coverage calling him the devil and realized he had become a celebrity. The more he flaunted his pentagram and spoke about serving Satan, the more the press eagerly quoted him. Ramirez began wearing sunglasses to enhance his mysterious image, fully embracing the role of a monster. Even during the trial, when one juror was murdered, other jurors wondered if he had somehow summoned demons to carry out the attack. Fear spread among them that Ramirez might target them next, as he often tried to intimidate them with his cold, piercing stares. Ultimately, he was sentenced to death and placed on death row in San Quentin. During his time in prison, Ramirez became fascinated by the idea of becoming a notorious figure like Ted Bundy or Jack the Ripper, curious if there would be books written about him. He delighted in the fact that someone had even made a movie about his crimes. In the 1990s, Jason Moss, who was writing to serial killers for a personal project, corresponded with Ramirez, and Ramirez reportedly encouraged him to embrace Satanism. Ramirez's beliefs appear to have been central to his desire for notoriety and to stand out, but it's hard to determine how deeply he was truly devoted to Satan. What seems more certain is that his urge to kill and the manner in which he carried out his crimes were influenced significantly by his cousin Mike's psychological impact on him, combined with Ramirez's belief that killing gave him godlike power. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, left a haunting legacy of terror that still echoes decades later. His crimes shattered lives and instilled a fear that gripped entire communities. Yet, his story is not only one of darkness but also of the resilience of his victims, the determination of law enforcement, and the strength of a society that refused to surrender to fear. As we look back, we are reminded of the fragility of safety and the depths of human depravity, but also of the power of justice to prevail against the darkest of evils. Ramirez's actions may have cast a shadow, But in the end, his capture and conviction proved that even the most elusive monsters can be brought to justice. The Night Stalker sought to spread chaos and fear, but his reign came to an end because of the vigilance and bravery of ordinary people. As history remembers his crimes, let us also remember the courage and strength of those who stood against him. In the battle between light and darkness, it is always the light that triumphs.